You're listening to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, September 12th, 2024.
People will say, well, this is the truth. And I have to say, well, it doesn't seem like the truth. It can't always follow the way it happened in reality. It has to have its own truth. Fiction has to have its own truth.
Welcome to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, where we host conversations with authors and artists from Chicagoland and around the world. I'm your host, Dylan Zavagno, the Adult Services Coordinator at the library. Today, I have the pleasure of sharing a conversation with Lois Baer Barr, a poet and fiction writer who lives right next door to our village of Deerfield, Illinois, in Riverwoods, Illinois. The occasion is the publication of her first novel, The Tailor's Daughter, put out by the small press Water's Edge Press in 2023. The novel draws on her own family history, chronicling the life of a Jewish immigrant family who makes their home in Louisville, Kentucky in the 1920s and 30s. We learn how Lois incorporated her research into fascinating history, including the Great Flood of the Ohio River in 1937, and how she's translated her family stories into the truth of fiction. An emerita professor of Spanish at nearby Lake Forest College, Lois Baer was also a finalist for the 2019 Rita Dove Poetry Award and has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize for her fiction and poetry. She is also the author of the poetry chapbook Biopoesis, which won Poetica's 2013 Chapbook Award, and her chapbook of fiction, Lope de Vega's Daughter, was published in 2019 by Red Bird Press. Her recent chapbook of poetry, Tracks, Poems on the L, was published in 2022 by Finishing Line Press. We start our conversation there. So on our podcast, we interview authors from Chicagoland and around the world, but you are one of our hyper-local authors, and you're actually from Riverwoods, a town over. And I also just confirmed with you no relation to Lisa Barr, previous podcast guest, episode 59 last year, but I understand you do have a relationship to some of our past podcast guests. Episode 18, we interviewed some people from the Deerfield Poets Group. Oh. And I believe you thank them in your books, M.J. Gabrielson, Herb Berman, Jacqueline Nicole Harris. That was episode 18 all the way back in 2018. So I want to say to you, you have been on our radar for a very long time. And I'm very excited to finally be talking to you. So in 2019, there was a Tribune article, and it's part of my job to keep tabs on, these local authors here. And the article said, I'm going to read the title, "That woman eavesdropping on your conversation on the train might be this award-winning poet who finds inspiration in the everyday rhythms of the L." So tell us about this series of poems you are working on that do incorporate these overheard conversations and observations.
Yes, be careful.
Right.
Anywhere you see me, in Starbucks, anywhere, I could be listening.
Yeah.
Because I'm a language teacher by profession, and language is what starts my work, really. And I overhear things, and it might have a rhythm, or it might intrigue me, and it leaves room for me to imagine a story. And going on the L, taking the L, was serendipitous. I was writing at a workshop in Chicago after I retired from, years of teaching Spanish at Lake Forest College.
Yeah.
And so the director of the Writer's Workspace, Amy Davis, she's wonderful, allowed me to park behind the workspace and jump on the L because I was tutoring in Old Town in this pocket of poverty, and there was no place to park for blocks unless you lived in that neighborhood. So, it was very wealthy, but just one, the Marshall Fields housing was still there. It's not far from where Cabrini Green used to be. And so taking the L was really new for me. And one day I'd always get to the school where I was tutoring. I was a reading buddy to second grade boys. And I had rushed in because I had seen something on the L and wanted to write it down. And then it started to become a habit. You know, I'll often stick a chapbook of poetry in my pocket when I'm traveling, when I'm on a plane, bus, or train. And then I started writing on the L. And then I started taking my stupid scientific surveys of,
oh, I love them. I'm going to have you read some of those, too.
I am so not a scientist. So I guess I finally turned the title into sociological or something like that.
Well, let's hear them right now, because those are the two poems I wanted to hear from this book.
Oh, great.
Before we get into your new novel, but Social Science Study 1 and Social Science Study 2. This book, Tracks, Poems on the L, came out in 2022, so just a couple years ago.
Yes. Social Science Study 1. I'm keeping track of writers who use electronic devices versus readers of paper on the red line of the L at the Bryn Mawr station at 8:40 a.m. Though people offer me their seats, prompted no doubt by the announcement, priority seating is for the elderly and disabled. For the sake of the study, I stand. Don't trust my numbers. I get distracted. Today, I decided 88 was the meter of the wheels along the track. And anyway, sometimes the car is crowded. And at my height, I can only study the shoes. I was dying to ask this guy with tweedy wool sneakers where he got them, or ask the slender guy in fatigues where he's being deployed. He was studying instructions to Union Station. Social Science Study 2. I watch for the greening of trees at parks and Graceland Cemetery. But I need to focus on the readers of books versus readers on cell phones and Kindles. I realize I can't go up to each one to see whether they're playing Candy Crunch or reading War and Peace. Anyway, something will surely distract me, and since I'm keeping the numbers in my head, I can only give an estimated interim report. On 14 rides in April and May of 2019, 19% of riders read on paper. 78% use electronic devices, and 3% just doze, stare into space, or people watch. Next year, I can track purses versus backpacks, or how many people like me brazenly stare at others.
This is such a memorable premise, and I think it says a lot about you as a writer. And I think what makes those poems work so well is that kind of tension between the social science and the poet who says, oh, I don't know anything, don't trust my numbers, but then you give us these really exact details. And I guess, I mean, they seem accurate, or at least as, delightful as you can make them. But maybe you could tell us about yourself as a writer or person who both gets easily distracted, but also wants to give us the truth at the same time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I can get lost in the details. Yeah. And I also work from the small out. It frustrates my husband no end. He's like, go for the big picture.
Yeah.
I do watercolor, and it tends to be very small, and he wants me to do big, bold colors. He wants to take my hand and get a big brush and just, do this big red rose or. But I think that's both, it's a problem, because I do I get to too many details and get lost in the details. But I do also think that allows me to catch things that other people might not see. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then I'm not a very threatening-looking person. I'm not big, and so I guess people don't feel threatened if I'm looking at them, or they smile back, or they usually aren't upset when I'm looking at them.
I think maybe we'll transition into the novel now, because I was thinking about that last line of like, how many people are like me who brazenly stare at others? And I thought probably the people we most stare at is our parents.
Ooh.
And I think it's very interesting, this transition into this novel, which is really based on your memories, I believe. But there's this sort of a difference maybe in external stimulus on the L versus all of these internal memories. So I just maybe talk about how this project came. Were you always staring at your parents too and wanting to write about them?
Oh my gosh, I never thought of that. I think I feel a poem coming on.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you. Oh dear, let's see. Well, it's really my mother's memories.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I didn't pay attention to her. She was a small woman, and we were, like most kids, not always really being very good. And she was a great storyteller, and she was a skilled musician. I took her for granted. She played for my ballet classes, but I thought everybody could play piano like that. It was just a very everyday thing. But as I got older, and she got older, I paid more attention to her and really started asking her. And thank goodness, I got a lot of the stories that make up this book, a lot of things that happened to her living over the Tailor shop in Louisville, Kentucky, Jewish immigrants, living next door to the Lutheran church. In fact, she must have really described the Lutheran minister so well that the granddaughter found me on the web because she was researching her grandfather and found my short story.
Oh, my gosh.
It was at that time called Mrs. Parmenter's Dress. That's the real name of the piano teacher. And she said, did your mother know? I mean, did you know my grandfather? And I said, no, not at all. She said, well, he was so stern, and you really got him. But I was like, no, I didn't know him, but I guess my mother, described him. And my mother described one kindness. My mother's family kept kosher, very strict kosher. That's a big part of the book, too. Yeah. And they would have the minister's kids over to eat a lot, but they couldn't reciprocate because of the dishes and the food and everything. So finally, the minister asked my grandmother, who's Molly in the book, but she's Edith in real. She was Edith. What if we were to serve on paper plates canned peaches and cottage cheese? Oh. And so out of that detail, I really felt a concern, a neighborliness that was, there's both the tension of being next door to the Lutheran church, which was not so long before the novel started, the German Lutheran church.
You're talking about, your mother staring at the neighbor staring back and finding out enough to, help out or reach out to them. Yes. And my mother, I remember what I did pick up as a kid was that any time there was a lot of rain or a threat of flash floods, my mother got so upset, and she told us about living through the flood of the Ohio River, the 1937 flood. And I've picked it up, too, because we live across from the Des Plaines River. And we've had flooding here, right.
3 floods in our neighborhood, 3 100-year floods.
Wow.
And so I picked up that angst from my mother for sure, but then later asked her a bunch of stories.
Oh, my gosh. It must have seemed, did you make the connection at the time to Noah's Ark? Did you think as a kid somewhere in your brain was like, this was biblical? Because that's the way it's presented in the novel here.
Not at all, And when I was teaching, university teaching, I also had to write in the summers literary criticism. And I would look for things like that, but I didn't see this.
Right.
And I've had a print review at a journal in Mississippi, Valley Voices, and the woman is a Jewish studies specialist from China. And the title of it was Noah's Ark in The Tailor's Daughter. And I thought, darn, she got it.
Wow.
But I didn't.
Yeah.
And you got it. I didn't see it.
Well, and I even found, researching you online, a little flash fiction piece you had done, Ark of Colors, that is about Noah's Ark too. So this is somewhere in your brain.
Well, I really, as an adult, started studying Bible much more seriously. As a kid, we did not pay attention in Sunday school. Not at all.
So one of the things that was really interesting to me about your work, and it's something you say in your acknowledgments and also in an interview you did about this book, is that your editor prompted you to not think about the main character, Bess, as your mother because you didn't want to let bad things happen to her. And we have to let bad things happen to our characters to create tension and plot and forward motion and all these things.
Right.
Can you give us that advice if we were wanting to write our own stories, or just talk about why you wanted to write this as fiction versus memoir?
Yes. Well, fiction in some ways gives you much more freedom, but in other ways, I do teach creative writing. I taught it, in Spanish at Lake Forest, and I'll do a workshop now and then. And people will say, well, this is the truth. And I have to say, well, it doesn't seem like the truth. It can't always follow the way it happened in reality. It has to have its own truth. Fiction has to have its own truth. And my editor at Water's Edge Press, I'm going to give her a shout out to Dawn Hogue, because she pushed me, and my husband too pushed me, to really make these things real. And there's a chapter where my mother is badly mistreated. She's attacked by a date. That was one of the hardest chapters to write. Well, I didn't know much about when the family lost everything and had to move from Louisville to Indianapolis. I only knew that my mother hated it. And my informant is my Aunt Toby, who's still alive. She's only 10 years older than I am. And she was a baby. So she couldn't tell me. So I had to figure out what happened in Indianapolis, and I had to figure out what happened on this date, and that was one of the hardest chapters to write.
Oh, yeah. I was imagining how hard that would be for you.
Yeah.
Maybe to get into this idea more, I thought at one point, I think it's near the end of the book, I don't remember if it's the narrator or in her mother's head, says about Bess, the girl was a worrier like her mother. And I thought this is such a theme of this book. Jewish immigrants from Poland, they're coming over, they're trying to make ends meet as, the father is a tailor, and they're worried about everything, status and pride, how dare you clothe my kids, to their other relatives, worried about keeping kosher, as you said, and then there's miscarriages. But then there's also, the father has this gambling issue. And it's just this idea of translating life to fiction. What was so interesting is usually, a worry like that in a novel will always pay off. I was looking for the foreshadowing. And one thing I really enjoyed about the novel was that sometimes there were worries that were sort of free-floating worries. It seemed like real life in the way of the father, for example, there's all this worry about his gambling issue. It actually kind of pays off well for him. There's these kind of twists where you don't, and that seems so lifelike. So I guess I want to ask you about just worry in general. Or are you a worrier, Lois?
I am not an expert. It skipped a generation to my daughter.
Aha, yes.
She's a champ. And my grandmother was the best. My mother was a very good worrier. I maybe you didn't see, but I have a story, How to Worry. And, I did that at Oil Lamp. I have this partner, Mary Francis, who got us a gig doing stories, curating stories at Oil Lamp. How to Worry, boy. The maternal lineage were champs at worrying and guilt and taking on, well, the cousin in Atlanta got a divorce. What could I have done to prevent that? So it wasn't just natural disasters or historical, pogroms and wars and famine. It was every single detail. Yeah. And my grandmother used to wait. She lived with us for a while, and she would sit and wait. She would sit in the dark. You don't want to waste the light. And she would wait for me to come home from dates. And when I got home, she wouldn't say too much, but she would just go to bed, and everything was okay.
There's that brazen staring again. That's all right. So I thought I would ask you the father, and there's a chapter, The Golden Dream, Saul. We know he has this gambling problem, and he has this dream of a piano. And Bess, the daughter, has been wanting a piano for so long, and it's almost like instead of free-flowing worry, it's the opposite. It's just free-floating creation. He dreams it, and then he walks right into the back alley, and he wins at cards, and the tough guys say, wait a minute, you have to let us win this back. And somehow he finagles his way into taking the piano as part of his winnings. And it just seemed to me almost like this counterweight to the worry, this other strain in the family of sort of seizing this instinctual, luck or something. Is that another thing in your imagining of this story, or is that just kind of the magic of fiction, or how do you think about that?
Well, I didn't know my grandfather well. He was in a wheelchair. I was 4 years old when he died. My brother Saul is named for him.
Oh, okay.
Solomon. So, but he was very talented musically. As I was doing the research, I found little pieces in the Courier Journal about he had sung on the radio, on the big WHAS radio, which was the big channel, and he was also a cantor, and I didn't know his voice personally, but there was a sweetness about him that I must have gotten somehow, and then from stories that I was told. And I imagined him, as you say, a counterweight to my grandmother, who's always worrying, and he's got these big dreams and is creative both as a tailor and as a musician, and just loves the arts, because that's something that my parents gave me, is this love for the arts. So
I think this would be a great moment to hear some of the book.
Okay.
And I really love the character Calvin, Bess's brother, who shares a little bit of that kind of instinct and adventure and gambling. So this is a scene during the flood.
Okay, I'll set this up.
Okay.
Well, Calvin is one of the few characters in the novel. Saul, the tailor, and his son, my Uncle Calvin, who died, may he rest in peace. And a lot of the personality I've taken from my Uncle Calvin. People just adored my uncle. My cousin, Sherry Lynn, said I could use his name. I only used real names if I got permission.
Yeah.
This is during the flood of 1937, which was in the winter and covered, about, don't trust my numbers, 2/3 of Louisville. It was devastating. No heat, no running water, no lights, no phone. And this, when I was doing research at the Lutheran church next to my grandparents' my grandfather's tailor shop in their apartment up above, they had a picture of the flood. Down about a half a block. The water reached a half a block from the tailor shop.
Incredible.
And there were rescue boats there. And you also could see the sign above, Solomon Cooper Tailor.
Wow.
They had that photograph. Well, I, almost jumped out of my skin. But looking at those boats, and I studied a lot of pictures. The University of Louisville has a terrific archive.
These pictures I've looked up as I was reading, it looks like Venice or something. I mean, it's just incredible. You can't imagine.
Yes, and
it's
then
up to the second story. Or
yes, people on rooftops with holding their pets, and my favorite one is Abraham Lincoln in front of the public library.
Oh, you're going to read that right now.
I don't want to ruin it. I don't want to ruin it. Okay, so my uncle does not want to be indoors, and he wants to help out with the rescue boats that are just half a block from his home. How do, Jenny? Seems you've got a kid willing to take Don his things. The woman invited Calvin into her apartment with a huge smile of relief. Wait, right here, honey. The place smelled like ladies' perfume. There were 3 women in the living room sitting around a card table where they had been playing cards by candlelight. Y'all don't know how important this is, the woman said as she handed Calvin a small suitcase. My husband has asthma and needs his nebulizer to breathe. It's made of glass, so mind how you carry it. Well, it will be safe tucked inside his clean clothes. Poor guy hasn't changed in days. They've been broadcasting from the hotel nonstop. Y'all just ask for Don in the WHAS newsroom. It's on the 5th floor. Can you remember that, honey? Calvin shook his head yes. Thank you so much. When Calvin smiled, the woman patted his wavy blonde hair. Y'all look just like an angel, she said. People call me Angel, Calvin replied, and the women at the card table laughed. Well, Angel, I want y'all to get yourself a little something. She reached into the dish of coins on the table and gave him a quarter. Be sure to tell my husband that I'm fine here with my mother and sisters, and tell him, well, the woman sounded like she was going to cry. Tell him just to stay put where it's dry and warm and let Foster and Pete go out looking for stories. Calvin had a little leather pouch under his shirt where he kept important things, and he tucked the coin into it before heading into the hallway to return the boat. The man who had let Calvin in led him back to his apartment and out the window. You be careful, kiddo. It grew darker as they rode north on 4th Street. The going was slower since the current was against them. There were candles and lanterns in top floors of most places, and as they passed other boats, they always waved their flashlights. At a certain point, Charlie asked Calvin to switch places with him and take over the oars. Calvin was glad to, because it was getting colder by the minute. Rowing would warm him up. As they passed the public library, Charlie pointed his flashlight at the statue of Abraham Lincoln. Look, boy, Honest Abe's walking on water. Lincoln's face looked grim. Soon they pulled up alongside the Brown Hotel, where the doorman and bellboys were at the 2nd floor mezzanine windows to watch for boats and help people get inside. Charlie handed Calvin a flashlight and the suitcase. Boy, you delivered this. We'll tie him up and just step in and get warm. But you best be back down here in 10 minutes and we can take you home. Don't lose that flashlight and don't dilly-dally. Y'all hear? Calvin said he wouldn't. He climbed into the big hotel. He had never been inside the Brown. It looked mighty fancy with all the men in their fine suits sitting at tables by lanterns. Big gold mirrors magnified the glow of crystal chandeliers lit by candlelight. Gripping the suitcases, Calvin asked a gentleman who was sitting on a red velvet couch, smoking a cigar, how to get upstairs. Calvin shone the flashlight up the dark stairwell and counted the floors as he climbed the 3 flights. In the 5th floor hallway, there were a couple of tables with kerosene lanterns, so it was easy to find the makeshift headquarters of the news station. Calvin poked his head into the open door and saw the newsmen around a table. A woman put her finger over her lip and came out into the hall. "This suitcase has Don's medicine," Calvin said. "He's upstairs taking a rest, young man," the woman said. "Could you run it up to room 809? By the time Calvin got to the 8th floor, he was out of breath, but not like the newsman in 809. He was wheezing something awful. Don took the suitcase from Calvin, opened it, and pulled his contraption out of its box. He put in medicine with a dropper, squeezed a rubber ball, and sucked slowly on a big mouthpiece. As soon as he was breathing better, he said, "You are a lifesaver, kid." Then he handed him a dime. You know what? He should be out of breath, shouldn't he? Can I go back?
Sure.
Okay. As soon as he was breathing better, he said, "You are a lifesaver, kid." Then he handed him a dime. Calvin backed up to refuse it, but the man put it into Calvin's pocket. Don put the nebulizer to his mouth and inhaled a second dose. "Much obliged, son," Don said. Calvin placed the dime in his pouch and left the newsman. On his way to the stairwell, he passed an open door. Inside a smoke-filled room were 4 men playing cards. He stood in the doorway, mesmerized by the sight of a game lit by kerosene lamps and the sound of coins jingling. Boy, oh boy, Papa would love this. One guy noticed Calvin and yelled, "Hey, kid, how'd y'all get here? You a fish?" Another fellow laughed and said, "Maybe he's a card shark. Want to play a hand of poker?"
Thank you, Lois. Now, you asked me to edit, but that was such a delightful moment when you paused to say, wait a minute, this guy Don with the nebulizer, he would be out of breath. I have to perform this in the correct way. And it just made me think, like, well, if you're, a performer of your work, very similar to best performing at the piano. This is your performance. You have that ear, I think. And yeah. I don't think that's too much of a stretch, because this is another moment I wanted to ask you about, which is when the family has to travel to Indiana. Mm-hmm. So Bess is now going to live in her aunt and uncle's house and rooming with her cousin Sarah. Immediately, we know something's up. So this main family is a little bit more observant. They're a little bit, it's very interesting because the grandmother says, Indianapolis, this is the wilderness. This is just so out of anything I know. But we're reading it and we're hearing it. Suddenly we're in a teen drama. Sarah is using all these slang words. You have that ear for it, absolutely, and keen. And we immediately know something's up. But it was both familiar to me, because those are kind of more, I know Indianapolis more and that world more. Yeah. But to this family, this is like so foreign. This is the, Wild West out here, even though it's maybe more cultured or something to us.
Yes, and I think it probably was wealthier, than Louisville in some ways, the Jewish community perhaps. Although the Jewish community certainly had, families there, German Jews from the 19th century who made big money in retail and so forth.
Yeah.
And also in distilling. But yes, the Bubby, my great-grandmother, I'm named for her. She's Adel, and I'm Lois Adele. Uh-huh. And so, of course, I never met her because you have to be named after someone who is deceased. But she was very strong character, and she thought, being in Indianapolis, the family ran the restaurant, was open on Saturdays.
Right.
That.
Yes.
Oh, my gosh. That was terrible. So, that caused a real rift, and it gave a lot of tension.
Yes, it's a kind of inner group dynamic, inner family dynamic, and you just get those words so right of the 30s teen slang too, right?
That was a lot of Google.
Yeah, it was fun. I also noticed several times for Bess, and it was very moving to me. There's a couple times where the public library is a refuge. And what I loved about it was that it's not just a refuge for reading and research and expanding your mind. It's like a physical public space where she gets her period and the librarian helps her. And then later, that terrible assault she experiences, she goes to the library to kind of have a quiet place to recover from the immediate trauma. Were you thinking about, the importance to you or your family of a kind of public library space in that way? Because for me, of course, it just...
Oh, my gosh. I did grow up. I went to that library. The main library is the one that has the statue of Abraham, gorgeous statue of Abraham Lincoln in front. And it's a beautiful library. And I remember just being allowed to be free there, to be by myself, because my mother played for piano classes maybe 2 blocks away. But all through my life, the libraries, all the different branches, they were beautiful buildings. And there was the teeny one where my mom gets her period. I remember going to that library when we moved out into the boonies, the suburbs, and reading through all of the little maid books.
Yeah.
And, oh, my God, they're not politically correct, all the little Colonel books.
Oh, yeah.
And, I just went through all of them. And then libraries have been my refuge throughout my life. It was kind of bad when I lived in Spain, because in Spain they could smoke and hang out, and neck in the library. And so that was not the best place to work. But yeah, libraries were really, and still are. I still write in libraries a lot. When the writer's workspace closed down, then I had to be at home and then masked in different libraries.
I was talking to a colleague about this, and she said, well, of course Lois would love public libraries that way, because she also loves the L. It's another public space that you have to,
Yes.
And then my boss said to me, she goes, well, maybe she'll do her next book of poems hiding in the stacks and listening to people's conversations. But don't do that. I'm not encouraging that. So we can keep the library a refuge for others.
Yeah.
There's a remarkable thing that happens at the end of the novel that I wanted to ask you about, where, we really see Bess coming of age all the way to being a young adult and starting to want to volunteer in the war effort and become a nurse. And she's in her nurse's training, and she's trying to help this woman who is miscarrying. And Bess says, oh, I know what you're going through. My family has experienced this. She's trying to share her family stories. And this woman says, so what? Just keep your stories to yourself. And I thought, this is such a remarkable thing for a writer to do at the end of a book where she's telling us her family stories. You're almost questioning the premise there at the end. And I just was wondering about this sort of, she ends up finding Bess, of course, her mother is a seamstress, her father is a tailor, and she realizes she actually can do the sutures really well. And it's a very physical thing that she's doing. But she first tries to do the story, non-physical thing to help. And she kind of reverts back almost to this. And I don't know. What do you think about this? Am I onto anything here? I'm just, I thought this was so interesting.
I think you're my ideal reader. I didn't catch that. And I was fortunate to meet many Latin American writers. I wrote about them and would, when I went to places and I would meet them, and they'd read my stuff and they'd say, oh, I didn't realize I was doing that. And I certainly didn't realize that the young girl saying that hits on a wonderful issue, which is that family stories are so private and you shouldn't tell them. And so when you're a writer, where's your best material? And there's a lot of things I could never write about. I mean, I sat in an airport. I sat in Louisville at Stanford Field and just wrote furiously, laughing, crying. It reminds me of that movie Diane Keaton is in where she's a playwright, and she's been jilted, and she's now finishing her play, and she's sitting at the computer and laughing and crying and writing. And I did that, but I can't tell you what it's about, and I can't tell you, I mean, it will never be published. But yes, there is a really, and a lot of writers, I think the best writers go past. They get past that, and they really dig into, and then I think we're living in a time where memoir and confessional is such a big part of what we expect in literature. And so, yeah, I think you hit on something, and I didn't realize that when I did it.
Well, it's just fascinating because we've read all this book, and Bess is really wondering, what is she left with here? What has influenced her? And the thing that she can really hold on to is the sutures. Mm-hmm. But then you, as the writer, have done this sort of non-physical performance to kind of reconstruct that.
Thank you. My mother was an absolutely terrific. She did quilting and embroidery. She did a quilt for every grandchild and great-grandchild. So, yeah, she was very skilled with her hands, although she didn't know how to sew clothes or hem anything. That was not part of her repertoire. Yeah. And I can't sew worth a darn.
Do you think about this book as your own quilt?
Well, the editor put the beautiful needle and thread between each part, and she said, "Do you think that's too kitschy?" And I said, "No, I think it's beautiful." In fact, originally I had imagined needle and thread on the cover, and then it's called The Years. It's a French novelist who won the Nobel Prize.
Oh, Annie Ernaux.
Yeah. Annie Ernaux. Yeah. The cover, when the editor asked me what would I like on the cover, I said, "Oh my gosh, I want a cover like Annie Ernaux's The Years with the photographs." And she figured out how to impose, I have this gorgeous picture of my grandfather's tailor shop. I was going to bring the picture because in this other half that you don't see, you see my grandfather. Oh, wow. Which we decided it's not his story, even though he brings us in. And then up here, you can see like a little balcony with wooden bars. You see my Uncle Calvin. He's a toddler in a little jumpsuit, and his head popping through, and he's trying to crash through the bars.
Oh, my goodness.
So it's just a priceless photograph.
Oh, I didn't realize the cover was an actual
photograph. It's
an
actual photograph of his shop. And then this tinted portrait of my mother, she must be maybe 4 or 5 years old. I cut out my uncle because there's the two of them sitting together in outfits made by my grandparents. And so I wanted that sitting on the desk, so they photoshopped that in. So it's like, gosh. Yeah.
Well, Lois, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You coming here.
And thank you for really everything you do for writers and readers.
You can find out more about Lois Baer Barr at loisbaerbarr.com. Look out for The Tailor's Daughter and Tracks Poems on the L. Both will be in our podcast collection, where you can check out books by all of our past guests. Or look in our poetry section for collections by our Queer Poem a Day poets. That's our show. Thank you so much to Lois for taking the time to talk with us, and thank you for listening to our 64th interview episode. Comments and feedback are always welcome and can be sent to podcast@deerfieldlibrary.org. Go to deerfieldlibrary.org/podcast to learn more about our show and find links to subscribe. You can also follow the library on Instagram, Threads, TikTok, and Facebook, or check out our YouTube channel. Links are on our website or in our show notes. We'll be back next month. Thanks for listening.